1967, and the Vietnam War is entering its third year of major American ground combat operations, with over 400,000 troops deployed throughout South Vietnam. Yet despite massive military operations and favourable kill ratios and optimistic official assessments, the Viet Cong insurgency continues to grow in strength, and the South Vietnamese government remains unable to establish effective control over large portions of the countryside. American military commanders and intelligence officials increasingly recognize that while conventional combat operations can kill Viet Cong fighters and destroy their bases, these military successes do not translate into strategic progress because the political infrastructure that recruits and organizes and sustains the insurgency remains intact and continues operating in villages and hamlets throughout South Vietnam, collecting taxes and gathering intelligence and enforcing Communist Party discipline while the government forces focus on chasing main force military units through the jungle. The realization that the war cannot be won through conventional military operations alone leads to development of a new and controversial program designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, the network of political cadres and shadow government officials and support personnel who provide the organizational foundation for the insurgency. And this program will become known as Phoenix, based on the Vietnamese translation of the original name Phung Hoang, which refers to a mythical bird representing virtue and intelligence. The Phoenix program will operate from 1967 through 1972 as a coordinated intelligence and counterinsurgency effort managed jointly by the Central Intelligence Agency and South Vietnamese security services, employing methods that include intelligence gathering and targeted capture operations and interrogations and in many cases assassinations of suspected Viet Cong cadres, and the program will become one of the most controversial aspects of American involvement in Vietnam due to credible allegations of torture and murder and the killing of innocent civilians mistakenly identified as Viet Cong. The program director for much of Phoenix's existence is William Colby, a career CIA officer who will later become director of Central Intelligence, and Colby defends Phoenix as a necessary and effective counterinsurgency operation that successfully degraded the Viet Cong's political organization through systematic application of intelligence-driven targeting. But critics, including many Americans who participated in the program, describe it as a systematic campaign of assassination and torture that violated both American values and international law while achieving questionable results at enormous moral cost. The debate about Phoenix's effectiveness and morality continues decades after the war's end, with defenders pointing to statistics showing tens of thousands of Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized, while critics note that many victims were innocent civilians and that the program's methods were indistinguishable from terrorism when applied against civilian populations. The Viet Cong infrastructure. Understanding Phoenix requires understanding the nature of the Viet Cong infrastructure that it was designed to destroy, and the VCI represents far more than simply the military forces that American troops encounter in combat, because it includes the entire parallel government structure that the Communist Party has built in rural South Vietnam over decades of revolutionary organizing. This infrastructure includes village and hamlet party secretaries who make political decisions and enforce party discipline, finance cadres who collect taxes from the population to fund insurgent operations, logistics cadres who move supplies and coordinate support for military units, intelligence officers who gather information about government and American forces, propaganda cadres who conduct political education and recruitment, and administrative personnel who maintain records and communications networks that tie local organizations into the regional and national command structure. These VCI members typically do not carry weapons or participate in direct combat, but instead work as civilians embedded within the population, often maintaining legitimate cover occupations as farmers or shopkeepers or teachers while conducting their clandestine party work during nights and in secret meetings, and their effectiveness depends on remaining unidentified by government forces while maintaining authority over the population through a combination of ideological appeal and intimidation. The VCI collects detailed intelligence about government officials and American operations by maintaining networks of informants and sympathizers who report on troop movements and planned operations, and this intelligence allows VC military forces to avoid unfavorable engagements while striking at vulnerable targets with devastating effectiveness. The infrastructure also provides essential services that the government often fails to deliver, including rudimentary healthcare and education and dispute resolution. And in many villages, the VC cadres represent the only effective authority that residents encounter on a regular basis, because government forces typically conduct brief operations and then depart while the VCI members live permanently in the communities they control. This constant presence gives the infrastructure enormous advantages in understanding local conditions and in identifying and exploiting grievances that can be used for recruitment and in enforcing discipline through selective violence against those who cooperate with the government. And American intelligence estimates suggest that tens of thousands of these VCI members operate throughout South Vietnam with particularly strong presence in the Mekong Delta and the areas surrounding Saigon. The fundamental problem that Phoenix is designed to address is that conventional military operations kill Viet Cong soldiers, but leave the political infrastructure intact to recruit and train and organize replacement fighters, making the insurgency essentially self-sustaining as long as the VCI continues functioning effectively. Previous American and South Vietnamese efforts to attack the infrastructure have been fragmented and poorly coordinated, with different intelligence agencies and military units pursuing separate operations without sharing information or coordinating targeting, resulting in duplicated efforts and missed opportunities, while the VCI adapts and survives by maintaining operational security and by replacing captured or killed cadres with trained replacements from the ranks. The program structure. Phoenix operates through a hierarchical structure that mirrors South Vietnamese administrative organization, with national direction from Saigon coordinating regional and provincial operations that execute the actual intelligence, gathering, and targeting operations at local level. And this structure is designed to integrate intelligence from multiple sources, including CIA operations and military intelligence and South Vietnamese police, and captured enemy documents while processing this information to identify specific VCI members who can then be targeted for capture or elimination. The national headquarters is located in Saigon under joint American and South Vietnamese command, with CIA advisors working alongside Vietnamese counterparts to establish procedures and to monitor operations and to provide technical support, including computerized databases that track identified VCI members and their organizational positions. At the provincial level, intelligence coordination and exploitation centers, known as ICX facilities, serve as the operational hubs where intelligence from various sources is collected and analyzed to develop target packages identifying specific VCI members, including their names and locations and organizational roles. And these ICX centers employ both American advisors and Vietnamese intelligence officers who review the available information and prioritize targets based on their assessed importance to the insurgent organization. The targeting process theoretically requires multiple sources of intelligence confirming an individual's VCI membership before they are designated for neutralization, but in practice the quality of intelligence varies enormously, and many individuals are targeted based on questionable or incomplete information, leading to capture or killing of people who have minimal or no actual involvement with the Viet Cong. The operational component of Phoenix consists primarily of Provincial Reconnaissance Units, the PRUs, which are paramilitary teams recruited and trained by the CIA to conduct raids and ambushes and targeted operations against identified VCI members, and these PRU teams typically include former Viet Cong who have defected under the Chieu Hoi program, along with South Vietnamese soldiers, and in many cases criminals released from prison in exchange for serving in these dangerous units. The PRUs operate under CIA advisors who accompany them on missions and provide tactical guidance and coordinate air support and medical evacuation when needed. And these American advisors are often former Special Forces soldiers or CIA paramilitary officers with extensive combat experience who understand the irregular warfare environment in which they operate. The PRU missions typically involve nighttime raids on villages or hamlets where intelligence indicates VCI members are located, with the teams moving quietly to surround the target location before launching assault to capture or kill the designated individuals, and these operations often result in firefights when the targets resist or when VC military units respond to defend their political cadres. The ROE, or Rules of Engagement, for PRU operations officially prioritize capture over killing because live prisoners can provide valuable intelligence through interrogation, but the reality in combat situations where targets are armed and resist capture means that many VCI members are killed during raids, rather than being taken alive, and in some cases PRU members deliberately execute suspects, rather than attempting capture because dead targets cannot escape or provide false information. The interrogation centres, once VCI suspects are captured by PRU operations, or through other means they are taken to provincial interrogation centres, where they are questioned to extract intelligence about other VCI members and about insurgent operations and plans. And these interrogation facilities become sites of systematic torture and abuse, as interrogators employ brutal methods to force cooperation from suspects, who may or may not actually be Viet Cong cadres. The interrogation techniques include beatings with fists and clubs, electric shock applied to genitals and other sensitive areas, water torture where suspects are held underwater until near drowning, the infamous tiger cages where prisoners are kept in cramped concrete cells, exposed to the elements and given minimal food and water, and field telephone generators used to deliver electric shocks that cause excruciating pain without leaving obvious physical marks. Many American advisors witness or participate in these interrogations and later describe the experience as morally devastating, because they watch or facilitate torture of people who may be innocent while being told that these methods are necessary to save American lives by gathering intelligence that prevents attacks. And the psychological burden of this participation in systematic abuse creates lasting trauma for many participants who struggle to reconcile their actions with their understanding of American values and military honor. Some advisors attempt to stop or limit the torture by refusing to participate or by reporting abuses through official channels, but they typically encounter institutional resistance because senior commanders and CIA officials consider the intelligence gained through harsh interrogation to be essential to Phoenix's effectiveness and are unwilling to impose restrictions that might reduce information flow. The South Vietnamese officials running many interrogation centres view torture as routine and acceptable practice in dealing with communist insurgents, reflecting cultural differences and the brutality that characterises this civil war, where both sides employ extreme violence, and the presence of American advisors does little to moderate these practices because the advisors lack direct command authority over Vietnamese personnel, and because some American officials tacitly approve the methods through their silence or their focus on results rather than on how those results are obtained. Prisoners who survive interrogation are often held indefinitely without trial in detention facilities, where conditions remain harsh and where many eventually die from disease or malnutrition or continued abuse. And the legal status of these detainees remains ambiguous because South Vietnamese law during wartime provides minimal protections, and because American officials argue that these are Vietnamese operations over which the United States has only advisory influence. The neutralization statistics. Phoenix program officials track their operations through detailed statistics that categorize VCI members as neutralized through one of three mechanisms: killed, captured, or rallied. With rallied referring to individuals who voluntarily defect to the government side under the Shu Hoi program, and these statistics become the primary metric for assessing the program's effectiveness and for justifying continued funding and support. The official numbers compiled during Phoenix operations from 1967 through 1972 indicate approximately 20,000 VCI members killed, approximately 30,000 captured, and approximately 17,000 rallied, for a total of approximately 67,000 neutralized during the program's existence. And these figures are presented as evidence that Phoenix successfully degraded the Viet Cong's organizational capability by removing tens of thousands of cadres from the insurgent structure. However, these statistics prove deeply problematic when examined critically because the methods used to confirm VCI status are often unreliable, and the pressure to meet quotas creates incentives to classify anyone killed or captured during operations as VCI, regardless of actual evidence. And many of the individuals counted as neutralized VCI members were likely civilians caught up in operations targeting entire villages suspected of VC sympathies rather than specific identified cadres. The quota system, implemented at provincial levels, requires each province to neutralize a certain number of VCI members per month, and this creates perverse incentives where PRU teams and police forces arrest or kill random civilians to fill their quotas rather than conducting careful intelligence-driven operations against legitimate targets, and the body count mentality that characterizes much of American military operations in Vietnam extends into Phoenix, where numbers matter more than accuracy. William Colby and other Phoenix advocates defend the statistics by arguing that the large majority of neutralizations were legitimate targets based on credible intelligence, and that while some mistakes inevitably occurred in wartime operations, The overall impact on VC organizational capacity was significant and measurable through reduced enemy activity in areas where Phoenix operated effectively. Critics counter that even if we accept the official statistics at face value, the fact that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese ultimately won the war despite losing 67,000 infrastructure members suggests that Phoenix failed to achieve its strategic objective of destroying the insurgent organization, and that the moral costs of torture and murder of civilians far outweigh whatever tactical benefits were gained through the program. The American participants. The Americans who participate in Phoenix operations include CIA officers and military intelligence personnel, and special forces advisors and other specialists who volunteer or are assigned to work with Vietnamese counterparts in conducting counterinsurgency operations, and their experiences with the program vary enormously depending on their roles and their personal moral frameworks and the specific circumstances of the operations they participate in. Some Americans describe Phoenix as necessary and effective work that saved American lives by disrupting Viet Cong operations, and that represented the only realistic approach to fighting an insurgency embedded within the civilian population, while others describe it as morally corrupting and strategically counterproductive campaign that turned them into participants in war crimes while alienating the Vietnamese population and undermining American values. One American advisor who serves with a PRU in the Mekong Delta later describes conducting nighttime raids where his team kills suspected VCI members in their homes in front of their families, and he recounts the psychological impact of executing people based on intelligence that may or may not be accurate, while telling himself that these actions are necessary to win the war and to protect American soldiers from the intelligence and logistical support that the VCI provides to combat units. He describes the moral confusion of participating in what amounts to murder while operating under official sanction and with the knowledge that his superiors approve and encourage these operations, and he struggles for decades after the war with the memory of specific faces and the knowledge that some of the people he killed were likely innocent. Another American working in an interrogation center describes watching Vietnamese interrogators torture suspects while he serves as translator and coordinator for the sessions, and he recounts the rationalization process where he initially tells himself that he is not personally conducting the torture and that his role is simply to facilitate intelligence gathering that serves legitimate military objectives. But over time, he recognizes that his presence and participation makes him complicit in systematic abuse regardless of who is actually wielding the electrical generator or administering the beatings. He describes the psychological mechanisms of moral disengagement where participants in atrocity convince themselves that their victims are less than human, or that the ends justify the means, or that they are simply following orders, and he recognizes these same mechanisms operating in his own mind as he continues participating despite growing moral revulsion. Some American participants refuse to continue their involvement in Phoenix after witnessing or being ordered to participate in activities they consider criminal, and several individuals request transfers or refuse direct orders related to interrogation or assassination, accepting career consequences rather than continuing to participate in operations they believe violate both American law and basic human decency. These refusals are typically handled quietly to avoid publicity that would embarrass the program, with dissenting personnel being reassigned to other duties while being warned not to discuss what they witnessed, and the institutional response focuses on protecting the program's secrecy rather than on investigating the abuses that prompted the objections. The moral and legal questions. Phoenix raises fundamental questions about the moral and legal boundaries of counterinsurgency warfare and about whether assassination and torture can ever be justified as legitimate military tactics, and these questions become particularly acute because Phoenix operates with official sanction at the highest levels of American and South Vietnamese government despite employing methods that clearly violate both the Geneva Conventions and American military law against murder and torture. The program exists in a legal grey area, where participants are told that their actions are authorized and necessary for national security objectives, while being warned to maintain operational security and to avoid creating documentation that could be used to prove criminal activity. And this combination of official approval and official deniability creates moral confusion among participants who understand they are doing things that would be crimes if committed outside the Phoenix framework. The question of whether targeted killing of VCI members constitutes legitimate warfare or Criminal assassination depends partly on whether VCI members qualify as combatants under international law, and while participants in Phoenix argue that infrastructure members who support enemy military operations are legitimate military targets regardless of whether they carry weapons, critics contend that many VCI members are civilians engaged in political organizing, and that killing them without trial constitutes murder. The fact that many neutralizations occur during armed raids where targets have opportunity to surrender theoretically distinguishes Phoenix operations from pure assassination, but the reality that many operations are conducted with intent to kill rather than capture, and that suspects are sometimes executed after capture suggests that the distinction is more semantic than real. The use of torture in interrogations violates both the Geneva Conventions and American military law, and there is no legal or moral justification for the systematic abuse that occurs in Phoenix interrogation centers regardless of whatever intelligence might be obtained through these methods. The argument that torture is necessary to gain intelligence that saves lives has been repeatedly discredited by professional interrogators who understand that information obtained under torture is unreliable because suspects will say anything to stop the pain, and that more effective intelligence can be obtained through skillful questioning that builds rapport rather than through brutality that creates resistance. The fact that American officials permit and in some cases encourage torture, despite clear legal prohibitions, represents systematic violation of law that implicates not just the individual interrogators, but the entire chain of command that authorizes and oversees these operations. The congressional hearings. In July 1971, Phoenix becomes subject of public scrutiny when congressional hearings examine the program's operations and effectiveness, and these hearings provide platform for critics, including former participants, to testify about abuses they witnessed, while program advocates defend Phoenix as legitimate and necessary counterinsurgency operation. William Colby testifies as CIA officer overseeing Phoenix and provides detailed statistics about neutralizations while defending the program's legality and effectiveness. But his testimony is contradicted by former participants who describe systematic torture and murder of civilians, and who argue that Phoenix operates as an assassination program with minimal accountability and poor intelligence that results in killing of innocents. The most damaging testimony comes from military intelligence officers and advisors who participated in Phoenix operations and who describe specific incidents of torture and execution, and the quota system that creates incentives for abuse. And while these witnesses cannot provide documentary evidence because Phoenix operations are designed to avoid creating incriminating records, their detailed accounts and the consistency of reports from multiple sources makes clear that abuses are systematic rather than isolated incidents. Congressional investigators struggle to obtain accurate information because much of Phoenix documentation remains classified, and because current participants fear retaliation if they testify honestly about illegal activities, and the hearings ultimately produce significant publicity about Phoenix without resulting in substantial reforms or accountability for abuses. The hearings reveal tensions between different American agencies involved in Phoenix with military, representatives arguing that CIA maintains insufficient oversight of PRU operations and that the program operates outside normal military channels in ways that create accountability problems, while CIA officials defend Phoenix structure as necessary for effectiveness in complex counterinsurgency environment, where flexibility and speed matter more than bureaucratic procedures. The institutional finger-pointing serves primarily to diffuse responsibility rather than to address fundamental problems with program design and execution, and the ultimate result is continuation of Phoenix with cosmetic reforms that do little to prevent ongoing abuses. The effectiveness debate. Assessing Phoenix's actual effectiveness in disrupting Viet Cong infrastructure proves extremely difficult because the available metrics are unreliable, and because measuring the program's impact requires separating its effects from numerous other factors influencing the war's trajectory. But the evidence suggests that, while Phoenix operations killed and captured many VCI members, the program failed to achieve its strategic objective of destroying the insurgent political organization because the VC proved capable of replacing losses and adapting their security procedures to reduce vulnerability. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong acknowledged that Phoenix created significant problems for their operations and forced changes in how they organize and protect their political cadres, but they also note that the program's reliance on often inaccurate intelligence meant that many neutralizations targeted wrong people while actual VCI members remained active and effective. The most important limitation of Phoenix is that it focuses on removing individual VCI members through capture or killing, while failing to address the underlying political and social conditions that allow the insurgency to recruit and maintain popular support, and this tactical focus on neutralization without strategic vision for building legitimate government authority means that vacancies created by Phoenix operations are quickly filled by new recruits, drawn from the same population base that supports the Viet Cong. Some provinces where Phoenix operations are particularly aggressive show temporary reductions in VC activity, but these gains typically prove unsustainable, because removing individual cadres does not eliminate the organizational structure or the political appeal that drives recruitment. The counterproductive effects of Phoenix prove significant because the torture and assassination and frequent mistakes that kill innocents create resentment among the population and provide powerful propaganda for the Viet Cong, who can point to government brutality as justification for their revolution, and many Vietnamese who might have remained neutral or supported the government are driven into active opposition by the death or abuse of family members during Phoenix operations. The strategic irony is that a program designed to separate the insurgency from the population often achieves the opposite by demonstrating that the government employs the same brutal methods that it claims to oppose, and by reinforcing Viet Cong propaganda about corrupt and violent regime that serves foreign interests rather than Vietnamese people. Some analysts argue that Phoenix might have been more effective if it had been implemented earlier in the war before the VC infrastructure was fully developed, and if it had been coupled with genuine political reform that addressed grievances driving the insurgency. But the reality is that Phoenix operates within context of deeply corrupt South Vietnamese government that lacks legitimacy and popular support, and no amount of VCI neutralization can compensate for fundamental political weaknesses of the regime being defended. The fact that North Vietnam and the Viet Cong ultimately win the war, despite Phoenix operations that claim to neutralize tens of thousands of infrastructure, members suggest that the program's impact was far less significant than its advocates claimed, and that the strategic approach of destroying insurgent organization through targeted violence proved inadequate. The aftermath and legacy Phoenix officially ends with the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, when American involvement in Vietnam concludes, and remaining American advisors withdraw, leaving South Vietnamese security forces to continue similar operations under different names and without American participation. The program's legacy proves deeply controversial, with debates continuing for decades about whether Phoenix represented legitimate counterinsurgency or state-sponsored terrorism, and whether its methods can ever be justified regardless of military necessity or strategic objectives. For many participants, the moral burden of Phoenix participation creates lasting psychological trauma, as they struggle with memories of torture and execution and with knowledge that they participated in activities that violated their personal values and American principles regardless of whatever official authorization they received. The Phoenix program becomes case study in debates about counterinsurgency and about the moral limits of warfare, with some analysts pointing to it as an example of effective population-centric approach that degraded enemy capabilities through intelligence-driven operations, while critics cite it as cautionary tale about how counterinsurgency can devolve into terrorism when methods become indistinguishable from those employed by the insurgents being fought. The program demonstrates the dangers of counterinsurgency operations that prioritize short-term tactical results measured by body counts and neutralization statistics over long-term strategic objectives of building legitimate governance and winning popular support. And it shows how the pressure for measurable results can create incentive structures that reward abuse and killing of civilians. The techniques developed and employed during Phoenix, including targeted killing, based on intelligence analysis and exploitation of captured documents, and coordination of intelligence from multiple sources, influenced subsequent American counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations in later conflicts, and the debates about moral and legal limits of such operations continue, with Phoenix serving as historical reference point for discussions about assassination and torture and the boundaries of acceptable military conduct. Some participants later work in American intelligence and special operations communities, where they apply lessons from Phoenix to new contexts, including the global war on terror, and the similarities between Phoenix methods and later programs, including extraordinary rendition and enhanced interrogation at CIA black sites, raise questions about whether institutions learn appropriate lessons from controversial programs. For the Vietnamese who were targeted by Phoenix or who lost family members to the program, the legacy is one of bitterness and trauma that persists long after the war ends, and many survivors of Phoenix interrogation centers carry both physical and psychological scars from the torture they endured. The program represents for many Vietnamese the brutal reality of American involvement in their civil war and demonstrates that American rhetoric about freedom and democracy often masked willingness to employ any methods, including torture and assassination, in pursuit of strategic objectives, and this contradiction between stated values and actual conduct contributes to the moral failure of American effort in Vietnam that goes beyond military defeat to include betrayal of the principles supposedly being defended. 1967 through 1973, when the Phoenix program operated as joint CIA and South Vietnamese effort to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through intelligence-driven targeting that employed capture and interrogation and assassination, claiming to neutralize 67,000 VCI members while creating systematic program of torture and murder that killed countless innocent civilians and failed to achieve its strategic objective of destroying the insurgent organization. The secret war against the shadow government that employed methods as brutal as those it opposed. The program that demonstrated both the potential and the severe limitations of intelligence-driven counterinsurgency, while raising fundamental questions about moral boundaries that remain unresolved and relevant to contemporary conflicts, where similar methods are proposed or employed in the name of national security. The operational realities. The day-to-day operations of Phoenix at the village and district level often bear little resemblance to the carefully planned intelligence-driven targeting described in official documents and congressional testimony, because the reality on the ground involves poorly trained South Vietnamese police and paramilitary forces conducting sweeps based on fragmentary intelligence and rumors and personal grudges, while American advisors struggle to impose some accountability and targeting discipline on chaotic operations. Many District Phoenix advisors arrive in country with minimal training in intelligence operations or counterinsurgency and find themselves responsible for coordinating complex targeting operations while navigating Vietnamese power structures and corruption and interagency rivalries that make effective coordination nearly impossible. The blacklist compiled at district and provincial levels that identify VCI members for neutralization often include names provided by local officials settling personal scores or by informants seeking rewards or protection, and the verification procedures that theoretically confirm VCI status before someone is targeted prove inadequate or are simply ignored when pressure for results overwhelms. Concerns about accuracy. A farmer who refuses to pay bribes to corrupt officials might find his name on a blacklist as suspected VC finance cadre, or a shopkeeper who competes with someone connected to district officials might be denounced as VC propaganda officer, and once names appear on targeting lists they are very difficult to remove even when the allegations prove baseless, because the bureaucratic machinery grinds forward, focused on producing neutralization statistics rather than on ensuring accuracy. The Provincial Reconnaissance Units that conduct the actual capture and kill operations include many individuals with questionable backgrounds and motivations, including former criminals and sadists who enjoy violence and former Viet Cong who may maintain secret loyalties to their former comrades, and the unit cohesion and discipline varies enormously from highly professional teams led by competent commanders to essentially armed gangs operating with minimal supervision while conducting operations that blur the line between counterinsurgency and banditry. Some PRU teams conduct careful operations based on solid intelligence and succeed in capturing genuine VCI members who provide valuable information through proper interrogation, while other teams conduct indiscriminate violence that terrorizes entire communities and creates more Viet Cong supporters than it eliminates. The corruption factor. The endemic corruption within South Vietnamese government and security forces fundamentally undermines Phoenix effectiveness, because officials at all levels use the program for personal enrichment and to settle political scores rather than to actually target the Viet Cong infrastructure, and the flow of American money and equipment into Phoenix creates enormous opportunities for graft that divert resources away from operations, while creating incentives to maintain the program regardless of results. District and province chiefs receive payments and equipment, allocations based on neutralization statistics they report, creating obvious motivation to inflate numbers and to target easy victims who can be classified as VCI. rather than conducting difficult operations against actual infrastructure members who are well protected and dangerous to approach. The interrogation centres become sites not just of torture, but of systematic extortion, where prisoners and their families are told that cooperation and payment can secure release or better treatment, and officials running these facilities extract enormous sums from desperate relatives seeking to save family members from abuse or execution. The American advisors who witness this corruption typically lack authority to stop it because they work in advisory capacity without command authority over Vietnamese personnel, and their complaints to higher headquarters often receive responses that prioritize maintaining working relationships with Vietnamese counterparts over addressing corruption that everyone acknowledges exists but that no one has incentive to seriously combat. Some Vietnamese Phoenix officials prove genuinely dedicated to fighting the Viet Cong and operate with integrity despite the corrupt environment surrounding them, and these honest officials often find themselves frustrated by the system they work within, where their careful intelligence work and legitimate targeting is undermined by colleagues who are more interested in enrichment than in winning the war. The presence of both dedicated professionals and corrupt opportunists within the same program creates inconsistent results, where effectiveness varies dramatically from one province to another, depending primarily on the character of local leadership rather than on the program structure or resources available. The Human Intelligence Challenge. Phoenix's reliance on human intelligence to identify VCI members creates fundamental vulnerability, because human in counterinsurgency environments proves notoriously unreliable, with informants providing information for money or protection, or revenge rather than from genuine knowledge of enemy activities, and confirming the accuracy of informant reports requires sophisticated analysis and corroboration that often does not occur in the rushed operational environment where pressure for results overrides careful verification. The most valuable intelligence comes from captured VCI members who are induced to cooperate through combination of incentives including protection for family members and financial rewards and promises of lenient treatment. But these defectors have obvious motivations to exaggerate their importance and to provide information that their handlers want to hear rather than accurate reporting. The Viet Cong prove highly effective at protecting their infrastructure through compartmentalization and security procedures that limit what any individual member knows about the broader organization, and by employing deception, including creation of false cadres who can be sacrificed to Phoenix operations, while actual VCI members remain hidden and protected. Some VC cadres deliberately allow low-level members to be captured, knowing they possess outdated or false information that will misdirect Phoenix targeting, and this counterintelligence capability means that even legitimate intelligence operations sometimes produce results that benefit the enemy rather than the government. The cultural and linguistic barriers between American advisors and Vietnamese population create additional challenges for intelligence operations, because Americans typically cannot distinguish genuine VCI members from ordinary villagers and must rely entirely on Vietnamese sources whose motivations and reliability may be questionable. And this dependency creates opportunities for manipulation where Phoenix operations serve Vietnamese factional interests rather than legitimate counterinsurgency objectives. Some of the most effective Phoenix advisors are those who learn Vietnamese language and culture and build genuine relationships with reliable local contacts. But these advisors remain minority among the American personnel cycling through short tours without adequate preparation or understanding of the complex environment they operate in.